In the current age of Hollywood, it can be very easy to forget some of the leading men and women who went to great lengths to help define what a true movie star is and the many roles that would define genres to come. One such man was William Boyd. While not as famous as certain other actors in his period or the genre he helped dominate, Boyd was someone who came up the right way and made sure to translate what he learned onto the screen. Just as important, he was someone who didn't let injustices stop him from being the person he wanted to be, which is why his Hollywood career went in the direction it did. We'll break down the life and career of this man and why it's still so important today. Be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. 6. The early days of William Boyd. To help give you a sense of this man and why he is a part of the older generation of Hollywood, it would be a good idea to talk about his origins and his earliest days in Hollywood. Also, it would be a good idea to note that he was born in 1895. So yeah, he really is one of those older generation of actors that many of you likely wouldn't know about unless you saw one of his shows. Now, unlike certain others we've talked about on this channel, Boyd wasn't born into the lap of luxury. Just the opposite, he was born to rather humble beginnings in Ohio, and the only reason that William Boyd made it to California to be in Hollywood in the first place was because his family eventually moved to the state. However, even though Boyd wasn't ushered in as the next big Hollywood star, once again, it's kind of the opposite. He had to go and work various jobs to try and make ends meet before being able to fully dedicate himself to the role of being an actor. One thing this did for him was make him very humble in certain respects, and that allowed him to be a kind of everyman actor that people could easily rally behind. To that end, when he did get into films during the 1910s and 1920s, he was only doing small roles in silent films. He did have a handsome look though, and when he was on screen, he was able to captivate people, and that led him to getting bigger roles down the line, especially once pictures became talking ones. Things were looking good until something completely unexpected happened. You see, there was another William Boyd in Hollywood, and that one didn't have a great reputation, even having a legal matter that made them basically persona non grata. That was bad because William Boyd was accidentally attached to those scandals, and in those days, if you had any kind of scandal attached to you, you were basically blacklisted from studios and couldn't get worked. Again, the William Boyd we're talking about did nothing wrong, and so he had to fight to get his reputation back, and that led to him becoming the character he's most associated with. 5. Hopalong Cassidy. In 1935, with things looking against him in the worst way, William Boyd bought the rights to a set of stories starring a character named Hopalong Cassidy. This cowboy character would be played by William Boyd on film, and Boyd would also help produce the film, so that it would have a certain quality to it, if you will. Given his status, the film was incredibly low budget, but Boyd and his crew made it work, and it turned into something altogether more grand. Part of the reason for that was how Boyd portrayed Hopalong Cassidy. This was a cowboy who had a distinct look, but also had a moral code that audiences loved. He was a man fighting for justice in a time when that wasn't a given, and people were drawn to that. It also helped that at this point in time, Hollywood was big into certain anti-hero cowboys and figures, ones that you couldn't help but love, even though they weren't the greatest of men. Hopalong Cassidy, on the other hand, was a good man. You could even argue that he was someone that many should inspire to be, because he was someone who always tried to do right by those around him. Due to the success of the film and the fact that he had the rights to the character, William Boyd would go on to make well over 60 films over the next decade or so as Hopalong Cassidy. Think about what that would be like in today's world. It's basically unthinkable, and yet he did it. Then in the 1950s, when the television was starting to come into play, Boyd transitioned from the film screen to the movie screen and was basically a pioneer for doing so. 4. Success and standards. Now, usually this would be the part of the hero's journey where you find out that after William Boyd had gotten a huge dosage of fame and fortune, it went all to his head and things took a tumble after that. Yet that wasn't the case in the slightest. Yes, he did get a lot of fame and fortune and became one of the most well-known faces in the industry, but he also had a set of standards that traced back to his earliest days that wouldn't allow him to do certain acts. For example, brands are always looking for spokespersons to promote their products. It's as classic as anything in Hollywood or the sales industry. The catch is that many of these products, especially back then, weren't exactly healthy or safe, and when those opportunities did pop up, Boyd turned them down, refusing to promote stuff that kids could be harmed back in any fashion. Did that make some people furious? Yep. Did it cost him money? It did. Did he care? Number. He was a man of principles and many revered him for it. If there was one thing that he tripped up on, it was his relationships. And no, not in the he was abusive or was a terrible partner kind of thing like many other old-school actors in Hollywood or ones in this day. Instead, we're talking about how he struggled to find a balance between having a good marriage and having the career that he was good at. It took him 5 marriages before he found the true love of his life in Grace Bradley. The two were together until his death, and she was a true friend and confidant to him throughout the remaining stages of his life. 3. Investing in something more. Knowing full well that the lure of Hollywood could put him in a bad position, and to try and preserve the image of Hopalong Cassidy, William Boyd did something that many in his position usually don't. He stepped out of the spotlight to try and do something more fulfilling. Investments. He became a businessman who specialized in real estate, and he was actually really good at it. Thanks to his skills, he was able to make even more of a fortune, and that allowed him to be away from Hollywood and even turn down things like interviews with people who wanted to know more about him simply because they had nothing to offer him. He had enough to live on for the rest of his life. However, over time, he did come out and talk about certain other aspects of his life, including a key friendship with another cowboy by the name of Randolph Scott. 2. Boyd and Scott. In his later years, many wondered if William Boyd and Randolph Scott had an animosity toward one another, especially given how Boyd had basically abandoned Hollywood and didn't talk to many within it afterward. However, in an interview later on in his life, Boyd revealed the truth. That truth was that he didn't talk about Scott because he was honoring the man's personality and friendship. The two men had a kind of quiet dignity about them that truly shaped their lives. For them, the integrity of filmmaking and the effects that their characters had on others was more important than just about anything else. Boyd noted that Scott merely walked beside stardom and wasn't one to seek it out for his own gains. The irony here is that Boyd and Scott were never co-stars. In fact, Scott was more akin to doing action movies and even romance films. Even with that, the two knew one another due tot air parallel paths in Hollywood and being some of the most trusted people in the industry at that time. Because they knew what Hollywood would likely attempt to do if their friendship was fully public, they instead did things away from the eyes of cameras, which would reflect how they would handle their lives afterward. They would do lunches, fishing trips, and even write letters to one another. What really bonded them was their shared ideals. They felt that what the world, and by extension Hollywood, needed was something that young people could look up to and that their parents could enjoy with them without fearing seeing something they shouldn't. Something that speaks to what Hollywood is today in certain regards. Legacy was something that they wanted to ensure on both sides and to further ensure that it was lasting. 1. Honor among friends. The reason that this interview was so important was that there had been long-standing rumors about Scott and whom he partnered with. Back in the days of old Hollywood, such relationships would have been scandalous, and thus many had to keep their partnerships with those of the same gender under wraps. After all, if they were exposed, it could be the end of their careers as they knew it. But in a twist, William Boyd didn't out his friend. Instead, he defended him and said that whatever Randolph Scott was, and whomever he was with, the public didn't need to know about it, as it wasn't their business. Furthermore, he noted that who they were on screen and what they said off of it were the most important things to actors, and that Scott betrayed neither. His endorsement of his friend helped put Scott in a far more positive light, and once again cemented the good-natured cowboy that Boyd had been for decades. He knew that his friend had done nothing wrong, so much like Boyd did for himself in his early years. He stepped forward and took it head on. He made sure that justice was done and that a good man didn't have his name tarnished just because Hollywood didn't know everything about him. In many ways, the story of Boyd and Scott is one that sadly only really exists in these older Hollywood eras. In today's social media Hollywood, where stars are stalked all over the place and it's hard for them to be themselves without fear of betrayal, that kind of loyalty is rare. So, when you do see it, you should remember these two men, as they gave their all for both Hollywood and those watching, as they felt both were important to ensuring the future. Their story wasn't just one of respect, it was one of quiet resilience. In an industry often driven by ego, flash, and constant reinvention, William Boyd and Randolph Scott chose authenticity. They didn't chase every trend or try to be in every room. Instead, they focused on what they stood for, what their characters represented, and how their presence impacted the people watching. And for many families in mid-20th century America, they represented safety, hope, and moral clarity in an increasingly noisy world. For Boyd specifically, that became a cornerstone of his legacy. He wasn't just playing a hero, he was becoming one. Through Hopalong Cassidy, he gave young audiences someone they could look up to, someone who didn't need to curse or intimidate to be strong. He was the kind of cowboy who offered a helping hand before he drew his gun. In doing so, Boyd gave parents peace of mind, knowing their children were watching stories that promoted values rather than controversy. More than just an actor, Boyd became a kind of brand in and of himself. And yet, unlike today's celebrity brands that often feel hollow or curated, his was organic. It grew from real choices, real sacrifices, and real beliefs. That's why Hopalong Cassidy merchandise, lunchboxes, toy guns, comic books, even bicycles flew off shelves. Kids didn't just want to watch him, they wanted to be him. That's a rare kind of cultural influence, and Boyd wore it with gratitude rather than arrogance. In interviews later in life, Boyd would reflect on this responsibility, not as a burden, but as a duty. He knew he had become more than a character. He had become a symbol, and instead of running from it when the cameras stopped rolling, he leaned into it. That's why even after stepping away from the screen, he remained deeply involved in preserving the Hopalong Cassidy image. He knew the world needed positive figures, on screen and off, and he wasn't going to let that slip away just because he wasn't making movies anymore. And that brings us to the core of what makes William Boyd's story endure. Consistency. In a world where so many lose themselves in fame or bend to the latest trend, Boyd stayed true. Whether he was on a dusty film set, shaking hands at a charity event, or quietly spending time with his wife Grace in his later years, he remained the same man, kind, respectful, honest, and loyal to those he cared about. But perhaps the most powerful testament to William Boyd's life wasn't found in the roles he played or even the money he made. It was in the legacy he left behind, a legacy of decency, quiet strength, and intentional living that spoke louder than any spotlight ever could. In a time when fame was becoming more accessible and public personas were often crafted by studio heads and marketing departments, Boyd's legacy remained his own. He didn't pretend to be a cowboy when the cameras were off. He lived the values his character represented. Whether you watched him in the theater, on your black and white TV set, or read about him in the newspapers, you got the same man. Firm in his beliefs, honest in his dealings, and always aiming to leave a good impression behind. His fan base, made up of young boys and girls, parents, working-class families, and those who just wanted entertainment with heart, never had to question who Boyd was. He wasn't trying to shock people, break the mold, or be controversial for the sake of attention. He believed that entertainment could elevate people, that it could educate without preaching, inspire without demanding, and entertain without sacrificing morality. Even more impressive, Boyd never lost his gratitude. In many interviews and letters from the later years of his life, he expressed nothing but thanks for the people who supported him. He knew his rise wasn't guaranteed, especially after the early scandal that almost derailed his career due to mistaken identity. So, when he did succeed, he never took it for granted. He cherished every opportunity, and he gave credit to the writers, the crew, and most of all, the audiences who believed in him. And let's talk about that belief for a second, because it wasn't just respect they had for Boyd, it was trust. In a world that often questioned the integrity of those on screen, parents trusted Hopalong Cassidy to be a safe figure for their children. And that trust is not easy to earn, especially in an industry that, even back then, could be harsh, exploitative, and unstable. Boyd's commitment to keeping his image clean, his roles wholesome, and his endorsements responsible wasn't just admirable, it was rare. When other actors chased scandal, Boyd chased stability. When others sought the rush of fame, he sought purpose. When many actors of his era faded into obscurity or became cautionary tales, Boyd became something greater. He became timeless, not because he reinvented himself 100 times, but because he never stopped being true to the character he built and the man he truly was. We often talk about Hollywood legends in terms of box office numbers, awards, or their ability to reinvent themselves. But maybe we need to shift the conversation. Maybe real legends are the ones who stay constant, who stand for something and refuse to compromise it, no matter how much the industry changes around them. That was William Boyd. And it's this kind of legacy that we desperately need to revisit today. In a world filled with digital personalities, curated social media, and instant stardom, there's something incredibly refreshing about looking back on a man who built his entire career on respect, earned the hard way, and kept until the very end. Boyd didn't seek to be flashy. He wasn't looking for clickbait moments or controversial headlines. His brand wasn't built on shock value. It was built on steady values. He proved that kindness, morality, and consistency weren't just good traits. They could be profitable too. They could build a legacy that generations would look back on with admiration and gratitude. Even as the Western genre faded in popularity and new generations of actors stepped into the spotlight, Boyd's influence endured. Hopalong Cassidy reruns would go on to be syndicated for years. Comic books continued to be published, and his memorabilia remained a staple in collectors' homes. More than just nostalgia, it was a symbol of a different kind of hero. One who didn't shoot first and ask questions later, but thought first, listened more, and always tried to do the right thing, even when it was hard. And let's not forget how few people truly walk away from Hollywood, but Boyd did, and he did it on his own terms. That alone is a victory worth remembering. He wasn't exiled or pushed out. He simply chose peace, privacy, and purpose. In the end, he understood something that many in the industry never learn. Fame is fleeting, but character lasts forever. So yes, the cowboy rode off into the sunset, but he didn't fade away. He left a trail for others to follow. And if today's Hollywood could take even a fraction of the integrity, self-respect, and audience care that William Boyd modeled for decades, we might just see a brighter, more meaningful entertainment landscape for future generations. That consistency wasn't weakness. It was his greatest strength. It allowed people to trust him, to believe in the characters he portrayed, and to remember him not just as an actor, but as someone who tried to make the world just a little bit better. And that's all from the life of William Boyd and the great lengths he went to so that he could become the man he felt he was supposed to be. Did you know about Boyd before coming to this video? And which of his roles was your favorite? What do you feel is the true lesson that we can learn from hearing Boyd's tale? And who do you think needs to learn from his life in Hollywood today? Is there another older era Hollywood star that you'd like us to dive into next? Let us know in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you next time on the channel.